Okay, welcome everybody, wherever you are, to the third session of the Virtual International Economic History Seminar organized by the Economic and Social History Program of the University of the Republic of Uruguay. We had the privilege of opening this seminar series with Joel Mokyr, and we had a splendid seminar with Stephen Broadberry, who spoke about economic shrinking, a very hot topic for Latin American economies. Today, we have the privilege to receive Victoria Bateman, who will present her 2025 book, Economica, A Global History of Women, Wealth and Power. The timing seems to be perfect, as the paperback version of Economica will be released on July the 2nd. She is now showing that for us. And she gave us recently the very good news that the book has been translated into 6 languages, including Spanish. So this is very good news for us. She previously wrote the books '73. We all know that Victoria is a courageous person who uses several means to deliver her messages, often controversial messages. But she's not here because of that. She's here because she's an outstanding scholar who recently wrote a book that has attracted considerable attention, translated into 6 languages, as we recently said, and received very good reviews about a topic in which much progress has been made, but much more remains to be researched, understood, and done. So, Victoria, thank you really very much for agreeing to join us today. The floor is yours. As we said, you can talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we have enough time for discussion.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead,
Well,
please.
it's a huge honor to be with you all today. Let me first of all apologize because I'm not in my usual smart attire. It's coming up to the 10th anniversary of Brexit here in the UK, and I've made a public pledge that for all of my public appearances, I will be wearing something themed to express my distaste for Brexit. So apologies. I am I'm putting on the fashion of the EU flag for you today. Right. I'm just going to try sharing my PowerPoint. Okay. Can you see that in front of you?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Um, so I was watching the news recently, and I saw a US commentator on let's say a right-leaning channel claim that there has never been a successful businesswoman in history and that modern day prosperity has been built entirely on the efforts of men. Now, what's surprising isn't simply that someone could make that claim, because there are lots of people out there, particularly on the far right, that will make that type of claim daily. What I think was revealing was that no one in the studio could challenge him because no one could actually name a female entrepreneur or banker or inventor or industrialist from the past. And in some ways that's not surprising, because when we look into the past we tend to think about the men who've become household names, men like these who are celebrated in statues in our former industrial cities. Men, the movers and shakers of economic history, Genghis Khan, Hernan Cortez, Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, and of course so many more men than I could note whose names begin with the letter R. Roosevelt, Rockefeller, Reagan. I think most people could probably name more male movers and shakers whose name begins with the letter R than they could women, from the economic past. So I think there is this public perception that throughout history, men were the people driving the wealth and the poverty of our nations, that men were the people bringing home the bacon, supporting their wives and children on the incomes earned in fields or in factories, and that women instead spent most of the past like this, as housewives. That whilst men were making money, women were dealing in an altogether different currency, the love that makes the world go round. So from behind the scenes, providing this secondary support for men within their communities. And in fact, open any starter level economics textbook, of a kind used in economics degrees in, course 101, basics of economics, and you'll find a whole section on how women marched onward and upward through the labour market in the 20th century, as part of a whole discussion about labour force participation and so on. Almost creating, I think, in the minds of economics students reading that, projecting backwards, that before the 20th century, women were not doing much at all actively within the economy. So I think really it's not just the far right that have this view that men were the active agents in economic history, the people who, to quote one social media influencer from the manosphere, the people who built and invented society. I think also this is a wider public perception, and it's one that in many ways we are implicitly or otherwise feeding to our economics students. And I think that is a great shame, because there is such a wealth of research out there, by economic historians, by archaeologists, by the whole community, the whole historical community, that tells us how, whether it's in particular parts of the world or whether it's in particular periods of history, that tells us just how important women's work, women's contribution was to the economy. So here I'm thinking about everyone from Ivy Pinchbeck here, one of my favorite reads, and Jane Humphreys, through to Joyce Burnett and Deborah Oxley. There's such a wealth of research, and that's without digging into the kind of archaeologists and that side of the historical community. So what I wanted to do with Economica was really to try to weave together as much of that research as I possibly could. Now, this is only, I was only allowed one volume. I could have easily written 20 volumes on women's contribution throughout history, but I had to restrict it to one volume. So to try and weave together as much of that research as I could into a single global economic history. So from the point of view of the general reader, this is offering an economic history of the world told from the point of view of women, filling a gap in the market that I feel we needed to fill. But in addition to weaving together that research, what I try to do is offer something new. And, when I, as an economist, think about history, then I would very much say that history in economic terms is one long and repeated story of rise and decline. Repeated rise and decline. It's the story of one civilization after another. You can see some there in front of you. One civilization after another, amassing great wealth, achieving great things before falling into a ditch, ready to be found by archaeologists centuries or millennia down the line. And that story of repeated rise and decline, one that at a big picture level we love to tell as economic historians, is one that, well, I wanted to punch women into that picture. I wanted to show that we cannot tell that story without women. So I would say that one of the key findings really of Economica is to say that in every successful civilization in human history, women have been there at the heart of the economy. And moreover, that on the eve of civilizational collapse, so preceding virtually every major civilizational collapse in human history, there was this process of rolling back women's rights, women's freedoms, women's contributions, restricting the contributions that women could make to their economies and to their wider societies. And I think that message, that we cannot understand the rise and decline of civilization without the rise and decline of women's rights, I think that is an important story that needs to be told, because right now our own civilization stands on a knife edge. We have achieved a lot gender equality wise that has helped us to retrieve some of the ground lost, for example, in the 19th century. In the course of the 20th century, the fight for gender equality wasn't just about reaching a new level, it was also about regaining ground lost in the 19th century. So yes, we have achieved a lot, but at the same time, I think we are at risk of moving backwards. We're at risk of losing ground again. So I think women's rights stand on a knife edge. And certainly working women, independent women, unmarried women, single mothers, so many women face backlash within society. And I think if we can, as economic historians, take charge of the historical narrative, pull back that control away from the far right, for example, to show that, no, it's not just men who have built, invented, and maintained societies throughout history, that women have done that too, then I think we can help to show how much there is to lose from pushing women into the home. If you firmly believe that our civilization was built by men alone, then you have nothing to lose from pushing women into the home. If instead your understanding of history is that we only got to where we are today through the efforts of women as well as men, you've got a lot to lose from backtracking in terms of women's rights. So I think, George Orwell is one of my favorite writers, and of course one of his most famous phrases is, and I'll have to paraphrase this because I'm sure I won't quote it perfectly, but whoever controls the past controls the future. That our understanding of the past affects where we go in the future. So unless we can communicate outwards how much women have contributed to our own civilization, then I think, we're at risk. I think history, when told right, can provide us the greatest ammunition to stand up to this current backlash against women, to stand up to modern day misogyny. So, what I'd like to do is to, obviously, there's a limit to how much of the book I can communicate in this one session. So what I'm going to do is to get you to fasten your seatbelt, and we're going to take a very quick tour throughout some of the key periods of history that feature in the book. And I'm going to, in a sense, tell history through the eyes of a number of the notable women that feature in the book. And that give us stories that I think we can go out there, into the school playground, into the workplace, on public transport, at dinner parties, to try and reset this balance. So, every time someone mentions JP Morgan or Henry Ford, we have a female equivalent that we can say, hang on a minute, women contributed just as much. So that's what I'm going to do today. And we're going to start in the Stone Age, and we're going to start high up in the Andes in South America, with the discovery of a 9,000-year-old hunter. So in 2018, the eyes of the newspaper industry were suddenly on this community in Peru, where the Willamaya-Pacha archaeological dig takes place. So this prize hunter was discovered, buried with the 24-piece toolkit that you can see in front of you. And this was clearly a really revered hunter, because to be buried with such a valuable toolkit meant that they were highly respected within their community. So they must have contributed a lot to their community. And when this burial was first discovered, the assumption was that this was a man, that this was a male prize hunter from the Stone Age, because the assumption has long been man the hunter. So for a very long time, archaeologists, whenever they discovered a body either with hunting tools or with weapons, by default, it was assumed to be a man. Anyway, when this body, when the remains were tested, it turned out that this was a woman, a 9,000-year-old female hunter. And she was called WMP6 by archaeologists, and that stands for Willamaya-Pacha Individual 6. So the Willamaya-Pacha, the archaeological site, and then the six individual, the six or the six grave, or to be uncovered here. So WMP6. Now, the local community in Peru gave her a different name, Wara Wara, and that translates as star. And I could be wrong, but my interpretation of this is that they called her star because of all the press attention that descended on Peru, because the international community was astonished that this was a woman, astonished that women were, revered hunters in the Stone Age. So I start the book in the Stone Age, talking about, findings relating to women hunters, the fact that across the whole of the Americas, between about the period 12,000 and 8,000 BC, about 40% of big game hunters have recently been shown to have been women, but then also, of course, the contribution through the gathering and how important gathering was within Stone Age economies. So in one way or another, women were providing for their communities alongside men from the very beginning of history. Now, Peru, I think, was a really interesting place to start, because if we look at 5,000 years ago, so if we fast forward to the Bronze Age, if we were to identify, the key economic hotspots in the world at that time, then let me conveniently say that there were, 5 big economic hotspots 5,000 years ago, and some of those are more familiar than others. So obviously Mesopotamia, China, the Yellow River Valley, Egypt, the place famous for its pyramids, Indus Valley, relatively more recently uncovered civilization, and such an interesting one. Continues to be new findings all the time about life in the Indus Valley. It seems to have been a very peaceful civilization, seems to have had high levels of gender equality. There isn't the same evidence of grandiose monuments to big leaders. There isn't the same evidence of slavery that you find in, for example, Mesopotamia. So a really interesting civilization, the Indus Valley one. But then also Peru. And, this is really burgeoning research now. And again, like the Indus, new discoveries all the time. I mean, since I published the book 12 months ago, a whole new, ancient city has been discovered in the Norte Chico region of the historic Norte Chico region of Peru. And again, much like the Indus, that seems to have been a relatively peaceful place. Again, unlike Mesopotamia, you don't get the grandiose statues. You don't get, you get suddenly big monuments, but not dedicated to, big, rulers who ruled with an iron fist type thing. So Peru, I think, really deserves a lot more of our attention as economic historians, and the Indus too. We tend to talk perhaps a bit too much about China, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. But right, so that's where we were 5,000 years ago. Since we know a bit more about Mesopotamia than we do about the Indus and Peru, I want to introduce you to my next female figure from economic history, and she lived about 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and her name was Lamassi, and she was a cloth maker. She had a family business. We could say that this was one of the first, not just one of the first multinationals in human history, but it was a multinational at the time of the first big trade boom in human history, the Bronze Age, when people were traveling hundreds of miles in search of tin to mix with copper to produce bronze. Lamassi lived in Iraq. She had her cloth making workshop there, and we know about her because of the letters that she wrote to her husband, who lived up in a Mesopotamian trading colony in Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, trading his wife's cloth. They kept in touch by letter. Her letters to him have survived. There you can see the archaeological remains of that trading colony in Anatolia where the letters were found. And they've survived because, of course, they were written in cuneiform on clay tablet rather than on parchment, and they document all of the business dealings. I mean, the Bronze Age, as I say, such a fascinating time in terms of trade. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk particularly about Lamassi and her cloth making, and really see her as an example of, other cloth making businesses being run by women at the time, is that cloth wasn't just something that was used to clothe our bodies. Cloth was a currency of the day. Before there was what today we would think of as money, and before there were, coins, never mind, checkbooks and credit cards and crypto, before all of that, there was cloth. And so cloth operated as a form of money. And this money that was greasing the wheels of trade in this first big trade boom in human history was being produced by women. So women had, and not just in Mesopotamia, I mean, in those other, in all of those five civilizations that I showed on the map, I mean, women had a real dominant role within cloth making within their societies, and cloth had a really important role as a medium of exchange. Now, sadly, what happened in the course of the second millennium BC was that women's rights started to be rolled back. And in the case of Mesopotamia, if we were to blame anyone in particular, it would be King Hammurabi, of biblical fame, who introduced the famous Hammurabi Law Code, and also arguably the first legal system of guardianship of women. So basically, effectively made women the property of their fathers and their husbands. And this severely limited, what women could do within the economy, within society, within the public sphere. Women start to disappear, for example, from legal documents, from appearing as witnesses. Women beer sellers started to disappear. Communities of women, the equivalent of convents, the equivalent of the convents of the day, either closed down or were placed under the charge of men. So there was this kind of backlash against women, this rolling back of women's rights in the course of the second millennium BC. And by the end of the second millennium BC, I mean, this Bronze Age, this Bronze Age world had collapsed. And, typically when people talk about that Bronze Age collapse, they talk about things like natural disasters. They talk about all of the social unrest. I mean, pyramid builders going on strikes, palaces being burnt down, the invading sea people. So the people taking to the Mediterranean on small boats in search of a better life. I mean, these are things, the kind of things that happen today, still today. And then all of the social anxieties that were built up around that, those are the types of things that people talk about. But I think actually the rolling back of women's rights and how that damaged the economy also deserves to be part of that story of both, the rise of the Bronze Age world, but then also the subsequent collapse. And then as we get, as we start to emerge from the dark ages that followed the Bronze Age collapse, we get into the Iron Age. And so now we're in the first millennium BC, we're into the Iron Age. And out of that develops, of course, the classical age, the age of Athens and Rome. And, Athens is a place that has received a lot of attention as being, the birthplace of Western civilization, the birthplace of Western democracy. It's famous for its politics, its poets, its playwrights. If you study classics today, of course, you will start with the ancient Greeks. But I think what's really interesting to me as a feminist as well as an economic historian is the two things I would say about Athens is that they had equal distaste for commerce and for women. Their anti-business spirit and their anti-women culture, I think, in many ways, those two were rolled up as one. Within Athenian society, women were very much seen as conspicuous spenders, as people that risked leading men into poverty. The Greek writer Hesiod wrote a long misogynistic poem saying to men, do not trust a woman with a sexy rump because she is after your barn. In other words, don't trust beautiful women because they will take your money. in Athenian culture, money was seen as evil, and women's love of money was seen as evil. And women's love of money meant that, women and money were kind of tied up as one. And I think it's actually interesting, having taken this big picture view of economic history, how so often where you find societies that are kind of anti-commerce, often you'll find that they're anti-women as well, and I think no more so than Athens. So, as an economic historian, then I would say perhaps Athens deserves less attention than places like Lydia, like the Phoenicians. I mean, Lydia, the place associated with the legend of the Midas touch, the place where coins were supposedly invented. Phoenicia, a place so much associated with trade in this period of history. I mean, they had these great cedar forests that meant that they could produce boats on a big scale. And so they developed this real advantage in shipbuilding and sailing, and so became the big traders across the Mediterranean, and went on to build, the Carthaginian Empire. Of course, the legend there is it was a woman called Dido who took this Phoenician trading culture out across North Africa and then out into the Western Mediterranean. And then the Persians, of course, as well. And of course, all these places feature in the Greek myths. But what's interesting is how much in all of these, whether it's the Lydians, whether it's the Phoenicians, whether it's the Persians, how much women in those societies are disparaged by ancient Greek writers. Ancient Greek writers, for example, had this impression that all Lydian women were sex workers. And they believed that because they saw Lydian women out on the streets, in the marketplace, visibly in the public sphere. And the Greeks, from the Greek point of view, if you were a woman who was out so visibly, so boldly in the public sphere, mixing with men, dealing with men, then you were a sex worker, because respectable women would be secluded in the home, they would be veiled, they would be covered. So and similarly, Phoenician women, Persian women, they were in the same way that the Greeks disparaged them as being, promiscuous drunkards, as being sex workers, and so on. So I think that is a sign actually of how much more freedom women had in some of these other societies at that time. And I mean, I'm desperate to know more about women's lives in Lydia, in Phoenicia. I mean, we know a bit more about women's lives in Persia. We know that they could own businesses. We know that they could travel. We know that a woman called Artemisia captained, led a legion of ships in the Persian war against Athens, the Battle of Salamis, the first big naval battle in human history. There was a woman captaining ships in that battle, a Persian woman. So we know a little bit more about women in Persia, but I would love actually, and again, it's really about to some extent more more research attention perhaps is needed in some of these other places, and then also women in the Etruscan society. Again, disparaged by the ancient Greeks. And of course, it's out of the Etruscan society that the Romans went on to develop. And that brings me to my next big female figure from human history, Julia Felix. A really nice example of a female property developer from economic history. So she was based in Roman Pompeii, and she owned a whole property complex. I mean, if Donald Trump is the property developer of New York, then she was his equivalent, but 2,000 years ago in Roman Pompeii. She owned an apartment building, she owned a recreation and entertainment complex with a restaurant, a bar, a Roman bathhouse, because of course, if you're in the Roman world, you've got to have a bathhouse. This is a photo of the gardens. So if you were there in her recreational complex, you could have a drink, you could dine, you could bathe whilst looking out on this beautiful garden. Archaeologists think that she descended from relatively humble roots, possibly from a family of freed slaves, and also that she was quite possibly the illegitimate daughter of her parents. So she's described as the daughter of Spurius. So certainly archaeologists interpret that as perhaps her mum was a single mum. Perhaps we don't know who her father was. And there were so many women like this within the Roman world. I mean, I talk about it in some length in Economica, but Roman women, unlike Greek women, had far more freedoms and far more rights. And yes, there was a legal guardianship system in Rome in the way that there was in Greece, but it seems not to have been as legally enforced as it was in ancient Greece. I mean, certainly women owned property, they started businesses, they conducted trade, they traded wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean. There's lots of evidence of women doing all of that. But again, what happened was that much as in the Bronze Age world, a backlash against women developed. And particularly as the Roman Republic started to morph into the more dictatorial Roman Empire, the fans of this backlash, the flames of this backlash were building, and they were being fanned by Roman emperors. So, for example, Augustus, the first Roman emperor, really tapped into the growing moral anxiety about working women, about women not getting married, about women not having children, about immigration. There was increasing backlash about the growing cosmopolitanism of the Roman world. And Augustus launched this attack really on working women, and life became increasingly difficult for women in the Roman world. And again, what I talk about in Economica is this did not help the economy. Ultimately, the Roman economy went on to collapse. And I think the alarm bells for me from history are that the Roman world 2,000 years ago looks so similar to where we are today in terms of the things that we're in a moral panic about as a society. And the response of the Romans looks very much like the response that is being offered to us today by the far right, far right parties. And I can tell you from the Roman world, it didn't help women, and it didn't help the economy. Okay, so the Roman world went on to collapse, and the baton of economic prosperity moves next to the Middle East. And as Europe is in many ways going backwards, the Middle East is on the eve of a golden age. You know all about this, you're economic historians, but really where I begin this story is with another of my notable women from economic history, one of the wealthiest merchants from Mecca in the 6th century, and her name was Khadija. She traded cloth, leather, animal skins right across the Arabian desert, up to the Byzantine Empire, down to Yemen, to the east coast of Africa, to, what today we'd call Ethiopia, for example. And she needed help on the ground to help with her caravan of pack animals, her trading caravan. And she employed a young man to help. She went on to propose to him. His name was Muhammad. I'm sure you know this story. He went on to supposedly receive the words of God, and Islam was born. And Khadija's wealth helped to fund the initial expansion of Islam across the Arabian desert. But more than that, it was the example that not only he, but that she set as a merchant that I think proved very influential in terms of the pro-commerce, pro-trade culture within Islam that helped the Islamic world to develop this enormous empire with its significant reach. I mean, as far into Europe as Spain, and then out into, towards Central Asia and touching India. I mean, this vast empire, and this wasn't achieved simply through conquest. This was achieved through trade. So at the same time that, within the Christian world, merchants were despised, within the Islamic world they were not, and that worked to the advantage of the economy within Islam. So I think Khadija there, just an early female figure, I think, who had a lasting legacy. And in the book I go on to talk about women's lives within the Islamic world during the golden age of Islam. And again, to talk about how we see, women doing all kinds of interesting things, and women having, more rights than perhaps people publicly perceive them to have had within the Islamic world. But then also how over time this backlash develops against women, and how women start to see their rights being rolled back, and how that acts as a slow puncture on the Islamic economy, to the point that by 1258 the Islamic world was not able to defend itself from the attacking Mongols. And so by 1258 Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic world, was besieged. And we know, the baton of economic prosperity starts to move further east with that. And of course, I mean, if we're going further east, again, this theme of women as cloth makers and cloth as the currency of trade. I mean, here we can't fail but talk about the Silk Road that connected the Far East with the rest of Eurasia. And women's silk production and their contribution to that. But also how in the 13th and 14th century, how silk production was challenged by cotton production, the cotton revolution within the Chinese economy. And at the heart of that cotton revolution was my next significant figure from economic history, Wang Dao-po. And so she lived in the 13th, 14th century, and when she was 10, her parents wanted to marry her off. And she didn't want to be married off as a girl, and so she ran away. She travelled along the river and then got on a boat and ended up on Hainan Island, and she was taken under the wing of the female cloth makers of Hainan Island. And they were a very innovative group of women. And they taught Wang Dao-po how to become an independent, financially independent woman. She did that, and she went on to build on the knowledge of the Li women, the Li people of Hainan Island, and then she brought that knowledge back into mainland China, and her her new machines, the kind of spinning and weaving machines that enabled cotton cloth to be produced much more productively than was previously the case, enabling it to rival silk cloth. They diffused outwards to the point that women were able to make more money for their families through cloth production than their husbands were making out there, for example, in the fields. So you might think that this kind of Chinese golden age was also a golden age for women, given how much they were contributing to their society. But what I talk about in the book, and one of the themes in the book really, is that just because women are contributing to their society doesn't mean that they are recognized for those contributions, and it doesn't mean that they are rewarded, and it doesn't mean that they manage to hold on to their rights and freedoms. Because sadly, what went on to happen in China was, again, as we've seen happening in those previous civilizations, a backlash against women. And to some extent, that happened through the legal system. So the new dynasty of rulers that came in with the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty, introduced a new law code that again played to the growing anxieties within China about working women earning their own money, women choosing to live independent lives rather than to settle down, have kids, get married, and so on. And I think one of the ways the Mongols managed to, in a sense, win over the wider Chinese population was to say, we understand your anxieties. And let us crack down on women for you. If you obey us and if you accept us as rulers, we'll crack down on the women in your lives that are causing you anxiety and trouble, your wives, your daughters, your future wives or whatever. So there was this backlash against women through the legal code, but also then through social practices as well. So the practice of foot binding, and this is something I know that economic historians have very much worked on, how foot binding wasn't just a social cultural practice, how there were economic foundations to that, how that enabled families to essentially capture and control female members of the family, to effectively chain them to the spinning machine so that the family could take the value of what their daughters or daughters-in-law were producing. So rendering women geographically immobile by binding their feet so that they can't run off like Wang Dao and build an independent life, so that the family can extract the value that women are creating. Very much, therefore, restricting and constraining women's freedom to make their own choices about the type of work that they do. And again, I think in terms of appreciating not just the rise of China, but then, if not a collapse, then a stagnation, I think, what's happening to women's rights deserves to be within that story. And then can you hear me? Right. Can you hear me? Right. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me know if not. Following the baton of economic prosperity, thank you. As the Middle East and China are stagnating, Europe begins to move in the opposite kind of direction. And what's always struck me is just how visible women were within European society, within European economies, at this same time that women's rights were moving backwards in the parts of the world that had historically been the wealthiest, the most prosperous. And I think you can see that, for example, in artistic depictions of everyday life. I mean, just some examples there for you. Let me just advance the slide. I mean, one of my favorite sources, and this really comes through the work of Amy Erickson, is a collection of historic business cards held at the British Museum from the 18th century. And here are a couple of business cards of British women from the 18th century. And I love these because not only is this, women who owned their own business, who were out there in the world, but they could be proud about it. They could advertise it. They could advertise in a local directory. They could have the equivalent of a business. I mean, these are trade cards, really. But what today we would think of as business cards or business adverts. They could do so proudly. They didn't have to hide their work. They didn't have to be ashamed of their work. Whereas in so many societies, women, they were there working, but they had to hide it. They were, society made them feel embarrassed about it. So I think, it's always struck me how, if we're trying to explain how Europe, how the West, or how Britain not just caught up with, but overtook the parts of the world that had been at the top of the economic league tables for millennia, that I think, women's lives are where it's at. Men's lives had much more in common across those different civilizations than did women's lives. And certainly women's lives were not perfect. This is far from a feminist utopia, but economic leadership it's a relative story. It's not an absolute one. And I think it is, I will defend this to my dying day that relatively I would much rather have been a woman in Europe than in, say, China or the Middle East in the centuries just before the Industrial Revolution. This is advice given to young women in the form of an 18th century woman's pamphlet. None but a fool will take a wife whose bread must be earned solely by his labour and who contributes nothing towards it herself. So in other words, you can't be a trad wife. Don't expect to be a kept woman. So not only are unmarried women expected to work, but married women are expected to contribute as well. And so in the book, I talk about how this helped to sow the seeds of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the West, and also how subsequently we were at risk of another one of those backlashes. That happened in the 19th century. I mean, this is something that, for example, the work of Joyce Burnett, amongst others, has talked about. This, including how it worked through the trade union movement, through professional societies, as well as state regulation, attempts to push women out of the most lucrative jobs, out of the workplace, in order to, from the point of view of men, save jobs for men. And whether it's through, the hard work of the suffragettes or whatever else, in the 20th century, that ground was regained and we pushed forward. So, we narrowly avoided the worst kind of backlash that happened, say, in China, the Abbasid Middle East, the Roman world, the Bronze Age world, and so on. So let me conclude. Women haven't spent most of history as housewives. They've been doing all kinds of interesting things, including most of the things that men were doing. But there is variety to be found in the degree of economic freedom that women had to make their own decisions about how they worked, the freedom to keep the rewards of that work, and the freedom to decide how those rewards were spent. I think those basic economic freedoms to decide how you work, to keep the rewards, and then to be free to spend those rewards, including to save and invest them should you wish. I mean, those basic economic freedoms, I think, are very powerful ones, and ones that it's very easy to take for granted sometimes. That we shouldn't see history as one long upward march towards women's rights and freedoms, that the pendulum has swung back and forwards that, I mean, to repeat the key lesson of the book, really, that in virtually every successful civilization in human history, women were there at the heart of the economy, and with much more freedom than, than we might have imagined, than the public perception might imagine. But what then subsequently happened was a backlash against women that resulted in a rolling back of women's rights and freedoms. Happened in the Bronze Age, it happened in the Roman world, it happened in the Abbasid Middle East, it happened in pre-modern China, it happened in the 19th century. We narrowly escaped it, and it is happening again today, unless we continue our efforts to stop it. The future, the fortunes of our civilization will very much hang on the current battle that is taking place in regard to women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this wonderful presentation. We have now about half an hour for questions and comments. Can I ask you to stop sharing so we can see each other's faces?
Yes. There we go.
You can raise your hand if you want to ask some question, or you can even write something in the chat. Okay. Gabriel Porcile is the first one. You're mute.
Okay, now
Yes.
you listen me. Thank you very much for great. Are you listening now? Yes. You can listen? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much for the
Thank
presentation.
you, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Super interesting, and it's also interesting that you are working on the presence of women in business, because some work has been done on contribution of women to science and to
Yes.
politics, but I think less to the business world.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, why do you think that this backlash happens, in the sense that why we didn't have a kind of increasing returns, so to say, in which the presence of women and the success of women and the expansion of the economy could somehow give to a more permanent or sustained support to the presence of women. And
Yeah.
the other question is what the role of war was in all this process, because we usually, or I think we have the impression that, for instance, in the case of Second World War, it was important for the mobilization of women and for them to be recognized as really important economic actors. So I wonder if there is some kind of pattern when you look at this evolution in this long period. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. Such great questions. And you've actually gone right to the one really big question, which is, why does this keep on happening? And I mean, there are so many things that I could say about that. And I would love for my next book to be on precisely that question, because in a sense, this book is about revealing that pattern. And I have lots of ideas about why this happens. But to draw some parallels, and I think hopefully you can see some of this happening within our own society. I think often what happens as the economy becomes more commercial, as more people, not just women, but men, we're out there, we're starting businesses, we're earning money by working for other people's businesses. We're more visible, we're doing things beyond our own home. And then what starts to happen is people get worried. They get worried about, for example, are their wives and daughters being exploited? are they being exploited by their employers, for example? And so, for example, the Marxist view, I mean, there's this whole section, isn't there, in Das Kapital, on how the rise of machinery leads to, women entering, factory work, and how this is really exploitative of women, and how it's not just bad for women, it's bad for their babies. I mean, Karl Marx literally looks at, death rates of babies in different parts of Britain, and then says, well, it's higher in these parishes or these counties because more women are working in those. So, working women are literally killing, implicitly, this is coming at the cost of their own babies. And it's interesting because that section of Das Kapital is missed out of some of the shorter versions of Das Kapital, and I'm sure it's because some Marxists don't want it to be known that there is this sexist side to Das Kapital, this anti-women's work, and how working women are, how it's killing their children. Certainly, for example, on the left, there are worries about how women's paid work is exploitative, and so perhaps we need to protect them from that. But similarly on the right, worries about, women being out there in the workplace and, that not being ideal, and perhaps they need to be protected by their fathers and their husbands. And so, let the men do that, let the men do the hard work. Also, often this anxiety develops about, if women are out there spending money, starting businesses, then men start to worry, will women lose money? I mean, in a way, women can't win here, because I think, existing elites worry if women make money, because if women make money, that's a challenge to existing elites. It's a challenge, isn't it? I mean, so for example, in Song Dynasty China, which was becoming increasingly commercial, women, daughters-in-law, your daughter-in-law was coming into your family with more of her own money. And that was a challenge to the hierarchy within the family that she was being absorbed into. It meant that your son had a bit more independence because his new wife had more resources that she was bringing in with her. And so there was this kind of push to and again, what happens when the Mongols take over is this new law code is introduced that aims to restrict women's right to their own dowry, to try and restabilize family relations, to stop women, wealthier women disrupting the stable hierarchy within the family system. But at the same time, the risk of women losing money, that's also seen as a negative, because, what if your daughter goes out, starts her own business and then gets into debt, and then you've got to bail her out. So, if women are out there earning money, starting businesses, then anxieties develop about exploitation, about whether women are causing financial ruin, whether they're disrupting existing hierarchies. And another really common anxiety throughout virtually all of these civilizations I've looked at is anxiety about women's bodies. And, this is probably one of the most apparent ones within the present day backlash, both against capitalism and the backlash against women's rights to some degree, fear of women selling their own bodies, fear of women being put in a position where they monetize their body in order to get by. So fear of your daughter becoming a harlot, essentially. And certainly within the Song Dynasty period, stories, there was a very famous story at that time of the daughter of a well-to-do official, a well-to-do Chinese official. He lost his job. He then passed away, and his daughter was left high and dry. The man that was supposed to marry her then kind of dropped her, and so she was left, even more high and dry. One of the family's former servants then said to her, well, you could become a concubine. I know someone who will quite happily take you on as a concubine. So this 18-year-old girl becomes this concubine. And then she has a really hard time. And while she's, traveling around with her, master, she then graffitis on the wall of the ladies' bathroom in an inn, suicidal thoughts. And this story of a daughter, a middle class daughter essentially, that had ended up falling into the realm of concubinage or sex work, just really fanned these flames of anxiety about growing commerce, and particularly about, women's, bodies being monetized, and, women selling themselves, selling their souls. So I think, these are some of the common anxieties that happen. But I think ultimately, women are valuable. And that means that they are liable to capture and control, because you don't want to capture and control something that is of zero value. And, we when we're out there, we are challenging so many existing hierarchies and so many existing ways of doing things. I mean, there's so much more I can say, but I hope that gives a taster.
Thank you. Joyce?
Oh, hello, Joyce. Hello.
Hello. Yes, I saw this on the internet. I'm not in Uruguay, but the wonders of the internet. I would say I found your book in a bookstore, and it was lots of fun to read because it's just got these stories. So I
Thank
mean,
you.
hopefully people who are not economic historians will pick it up because it has these wonderful stories in it.
Thank
Um,
you.
and then I also think that an important contribution is particularly all the material about the ancient world,
Yeah.
which is not very well researched. And I learned some things, like I learned that maybe ancient Greece wasn't representative of the ancient world. And I think it also highlights the sense of the cyclicality, that it's not just a story of things went from bad and then they got better, that we have the sort of, having the sort of more ancient material than I've seen anywhere else brings that story up quite a bit. Um,
Thank you.
and then I just say, of the sort of conclusions that you have, I think it's valuable to say, I mean, one thing you sort of mentioned already is paid work can either be good or bad, right? In different
Yeah.
contexts. I think that's
Yeah.
useful to say. And I think it's also useful to say that women's work is often hidden because it's in the house rather than sort of
Yes. Yeah.
out and about.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say I very much enjoyed those parts of the book.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And I mean, your work has been greatly influential. And I mean, I have an enormous
Thank you.
bibliography in the book, so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. So thank you. No, all really good points there, and the point about women's work being hidden, particularly when it's done in the context of the home. Um, Women's paid work can be, exploitative as well as liberating, and those types of things. I think really important themes. Thank you.
Victoria, can I
Mm.
I wonder, do you dare to say that every successful civilization implies an increasing degree of freedom for women, or you may find different patterns in different times? I also wonder whether your very nice examples
Mm.
are good examples representative of many other women, or they are just exceptions that confirm the rule that women are being most of the time
Yeah.
sent home.
Thank you. I think I'm going to begin with your second question on representativeness. I'm going to roll off some statistics because you're right that there I mention a number of notable women who's, for whether that's, Wara Wara, the female hunter, or whether it's Wang Daopo, the inventor from China. But let me reel off some statistics. I think I started with one for the Stone Age. 40% of big game hunters in the Americas from 12,000 to 8,000 BC were women. Another one, the worker cemetery at the Great Pyramid of Giza. One half of the bodies in the worker cemetery were women. I mean, when I first read that research, I was astonished, and that was some time ago now, but that's always stayed with me. Other things, in ancient Rome, there were 4 times as many female plumbers as there are in the US and UK today. And we know that from the female names etched on the pipes that were literally laid. 1/3 of the clay beds that supplied the bricks for literally building ancient Rome were owned by women. And then in the, thinking about medieval London, and I don't know, does anyone here like going to pubs and taverns and perhaps if you're ever in the UK and you want to visit one of those historic kind of very British style pubs, and they were really, they really were born out of the post Black Death period of people having more money to spend on beer and meat, and so you'd have your beef pie and your pint of your pint of ale or whatever. And what we know from the Brewers Guild from the early 1400s is that 40% of brewers were women in the London Brewers Guild. 60% of cloth makers in Industrial Revolution Manchester were women. That's something that Joyce Burnett knows a lot more about than me. Also, Ivy Pinchbeck, for example, she talks about the coal mines in Wales and Scotland, and certainly before the state regulations of, the regulating female as well as child labour in coal mines. There are parts of South Wales, parts of the Midlothian where 25-30% of the adult workforce in those mines were women. So I think, when you look at the overall percentages, then, women were perhaps figured much more highly than we might first imagine. But then also I think there are, the indirect consequences of normal women, everyday women being able to go out and work and earn money. And even if that was a pittance, the ability for women to just earn some money that meant that they could live an independent life. So essentially escape child marriage. And it's that ability for young women to go out and get a job beyond their own home, to then with that take charge of their private life, to avoid being married off by their parents, to decide for themselves whether, when and who to marry. And that's what really results in that high age of marriage of women in Western, Northern Europe in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution, where the average woman wasn't getting married until she was 25 or 26. This is the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, at a time when in China and the Middle East, virtually all women were married by 18. And, the effects of that higher age of marriage, we're all economic historians. You don't need me to take you through that. Other people have done that much more. But, whether it's through the impact on, population dynamics and with it on real wages, and then through that potentially, in a Bob Allen type way on incentives for mechanization. Whether it's the fact that families, because they were smaller, they could better afford to educate, so apprentice the children that they had, better afford to save. That helps with family businesses and so on. But also how that The fact that, women going out there engaging in paid work, that disrupts kind of traditional hierarchies within the home, and how that in turn disrupts political hierarchies. Because I think when we talk about the Glorious Revolution, when we talk about rising democracy, often we don't link that to women, to what's going on in terms of women's lives. And yet when you look at the writers, say British writers in the 17th century that were defending the rule of the king, what did the Cavaliers say? They said that challenging the authority of the king is the equivalent of challenging the authority of every father within his family. Autocracy and patriarchy rise and fall together. So as women are challenging relations within the home, that is also in turn challenging the political order more widely. So in terms of broader political institutional change, I think we can't disconnect that with the way in which women's ability to earn money outside of the home is disrupting home-based hierarchies. And then also another kind of indirect consequence of everyday women being able to earn money, even if it is just a pittance, is what Max Weber has called the capitalist spirit, or what he's called the Protestant work ethic, that I really personally think has nothing to do with Protestantism. I think it's been wrongly attributed to Protestantism. I think instead that work ethic, that capitalist spirit, has much more to do with, again, this change in family life, the fact that young women are out there earning, they're getting married later, they're starting their own household. And so, within society, as a young person, you have to work hard, you have to save, because otherwise you will not get married. You have to, the quid pro quo is that you're responsible for your own household. So you won't be able to afford to have a personal life unless you work hard, unless you save. Whereas, for example, in China and the Middle East, your parents arrange your personal life for you. They arrange your marriage. You're absorbed into this wider family system. So the kind of real stark, tough love, individual incentive is there in a way that Max Weber helped describe, but I think has much less to do with religion and much more to do with what's going on in terms of women's work within society. So I think it's not just the kind of notable women, it is that en masse you have this body of women that are just out there earning money, that even if it is a pittance, is in those 4 or 5 different ways actually quite, sowing the seeds, whether it's through technology, whether it's through skills, whether it is through saving investment, whether it is through political institutional change, whether it is through capitalist spirit, that is creating these positive spillover effects for everyone, really. I'm sorry, I can't hear anyone at the moment.
I'm sorry, I was mute. We have Monica now, and then we have another question on the chat that I will read. So please go ahead, Monica.
Thank you. Well, I am thinking about something. Maybe you said before. I'm asking to me if it is possible to get any money for, if any married woman may get any paid for her shop at home. If, I think any kind of subvention, sorry, or not only sharing her tasks with her husband, but getting some money for her work at home. I'm thinking if it's possible to any measure of not only in hours, but in any kind of money. I don't know how to say better in English. Because I think if a woman works at home all time, one thing is sharing her task with her husband or the another person, her sons and daughters. But another thing is to get a recognition in money, because it is different, not only a value in love, but a value in, because her works is
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, all of that invisible, unpaid
Great.
labor. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly by one estimate, I mean, certainly looking at the present day, all of that, what, just invisible, unpaid caring labor is the equivalent to like 2 billion people working full time for nothing, across the world today. I mean, enormous in scale. In terms of, whether there have been any societies where that labor has been, financially compensated for, let me give you one example. So something that I talk about in my chapter actually on the Islamic period. So when I'm talking about the kind of golden age of Islam, is Islamic law at the time relating to women's paid work. Um, and actually, breastfeeding was something that women could demand compensation for. So that was a type of, domestic labor that in theory, a woman could demand compensation for. A woman's breast milk was considered her own. She could choose whether or not to give it. And actually, she, a Muslim woman, if she didn't want to breastfeed, then the law was on her side and her husband had to pay someone else to breastfeed the children. And actually, um, legal scholars within the Islamic world at that time wrote kind of model contracts for wet nurses. And their wages would go up and down according to the market and so on, but model contracts in terms of, working conditions and expectations and so on. So I think that's a, just one example. Whereas I really quite like the work of Maya Schatz-Miller. I mean, that's another book, another kind of, well, she has so many books and papers, but, that's been enormously influential for me. And, she writes a lot on Islamic law and in relation to those types of things. So, yeah, Maya Schatz-Miller is very good on that type of thing.
We have a last question by Yolanda Blasco. She says, "Thank you very much, Victoria. I'm reading the book and I truly find the work you have done fascinating. Congratulations. I'm currently reading the chapter on women in the Islamic world. So far, I have not noticed a distinction between production and reproduction in your analysis of women's role in the economy. I was wondering whether you have taken into account the literature that argues that patriarchal relations were consolidated or reinforced during the 16th and 17th centuries in the context of the emergence of capitalism. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Silvia Federici, whose name
Yeah.
I have not found in the bibliography. It's only a
Well,
minor point, but it is a question that I find particularly interesting. This is
yeah.
not, they are not my words, they are Yolanda's words.
It's funny because I was talking about Silvia Federici's work at a talk I gave about 3 weeks ago, because again, it's been extremely influential. I should say some of the references are in the end notes and some of them are in the bibliography. So I kind of I was asked to save space to split it. So just because someone's not in the bibliography doesn't mean they're not kind of referenced somewhere else in the book. So So, Silvia Federici, yes. I really appreciate her work. I've learned a lot from it. I don't always agree with her. I am not a Marxist. I will put my cards on the table. I have already talked about the sexism within Das Kapital. Now, I know feminist Marxists have had a very hard time flying the feminist flag within Marxist circles. But, that isn't, it's not that sexist side of Marxism alone that puts me off. I am someone who values my individual freedom. I am someone who likes the fact that I can make my own decisions about work. I can decide how I want to work. I can decide, I can earn money. I can decide how I spend it and so on. And so I know I would not be happy in a socialist economy. And in fact, as a feminist, one of the things that really, really worries me about a socialist world where your individual freedom comes second to the public good is my womb. As now I'm a woman, I'm 46. I don't have to worry about my womb being taken over by the state to breed for the next generation. But, if I was in a socialist society and I had decided not to have children, as I have, if the view of society was the public interest is best served if you as a woman have children, what happens? Birth control is withdrawn, abortion is withdrawn. This happened within the Soviet world. It started with a world of women have access to abortions, birth control, and then population figures don't turn out quite as the state wanted. And then women denied access because, it's not about what the individual woman wants for herself, it's about what's best for society. And right now, given all the panic we're in about women not breeding enough and women not getting married, women not having enough falling fertility rates, and all the economists talking about what a disaster it's going to be for our economy because women are not getting married and having children. I mean, now more than ever, I fear a socialist economy because as a woman, individual freedom, it is not just about your ability to choose how you want to work rather than what, society thinks you would be better off doing. But this is literally about your body. And I think, the only way for a woman to be truly free is to have her own cash in her own pocket. Now, I'm not saying we can have a world of super capitalism without any, state-funded, healthcare and education. I'm a state school girl. I would not have got where I am today without, state education, state healthcare, and so on. But do I want to go as far as socialism? Absolutely, absolutely not. I think as a feminist, I have a lot to fear. So I think, yeah, I've learned a lot from Silvia Federici, but I think at the same time, I think there is something to be said for having for seeing upsides as well as downsides of free enterprise and free markets. Sorry if that if anyone disagrees with that, we could argue about it for a very long time.
Okay, we are in time. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much, all of you who have attended this session and asked your questions. It was really a pleasure to come in touch with you and your work. So I hope we can continue to be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.